Dorothy was born on a small farmhouse between Pumpkin Center and the Red River, about 8 miles north of Electra, to Jim Bob and Cad Bryant. She was the middle child of 5. Often said that being the middle child made her want to get noticed, and she wanted people to like her. Leanne commented, "I wonder if she ever really knew how many people loved her and how many lives she impacted." Dorothy grew up poor. She remembers a very hard-working father who farmed behind a mule and plow, and a mother who also worked hard caring for her family. Dorothy grew up during the Depression, which made her a saver. She saved everything. Everything from Velveeta cheese boxes to keep her pens and pencils in the drawer. She would flatten out foil so she could use it again. She washed out bread sacks. I remember one time at the church, Dorothy saw me throwing away an empty hot dog bun sack. And she said, "What are you doing? You can reuse that." And I said, "Mama Dorothy, we use Ziploc bags now." And she just shook her head, got it out of the trash, folded it up and put it in her purse to take home to her collection of bread sacks. Dorothy went to the Enterprise Country School through the 10th grade, and then she attended Electra High School. We saw pictures of her in Electra High School. And she graduated in 1937. She was athletic, and she loved to play softball and volleyball and tennis, even though she had to borrow a racket to be able to play tennis. She said she always felt a little inferior to the city kids growing up on the farm. In high school, Dorothy learned to sew in homemaking class and began to make her own clothes. This was the beginning of Dorothy sewing for lots of folks, all of her own kids, as well as almost anybody that had a need. Mike told the story that Dorothy would always embroider Eddie Frank Davis's shirts for him. They put his initials on his shirt, EFD. Then when they'd get handed down to Mike, they'd still have EFD on them. So Mike told everybody at school that EFD stood for Electra Fire Department. Leanne said that even though Mama Dorothy was a super seamstress, we know that, her daughters never really learned to sew well, because whenever one of the girls would get to that part of a project or a pattern where they needed help, like putting in a zipper, Dorothy would say, "Oh, just get up and let me do it." She made the boys Levi's out of denim, even sewed the stitching on the back pockets so that they'd look like all the other boys at school. She even made Mike a suit one time. And as you might expect of a saver, there's a whole cupboard full of old material and patterns and scraps that just might be needed someday. Dorothy said that she was just always around the Gilberts growing up. Pete would give her and her friends rides home after ball games. And then Pete and Dorothy started dating in high school. She said she thought Pete had just been waiting around for her to grow up. On August the 26th, 1937, Pete and Dorothy were married in Dallas, Texas, on a stairwell in the courthouse. That Pink Rock courthouse is still there. They returned to Electra, and for a short period of time lived with Pete's mom and his younger sisters. And then Pete went to work for Nana Tuttle, and they moved into a garage apartment, and Pete farmed. and Dorothy did household duties. And this is what gave them a start at achieving their goal of owning their own land and their own home. When Jan was about 4 is when they moved into their home. Dorothy always joked that it was an old house way back when they moved into it. Pete rented and farmed the land, and Dorothy became his helpmate. She was a farm wife, and she loved her role. Dorothy would do anything to help Pete. Once in the early days of their marriage, Dorothy convinced Pete to let her plow. That lasted until she came to the end of the first row and tried to turn the plow around. That was her one and only attempt. She would leave the plowing to Pete, but she would grow the black-eyed peas, and she would hoe the weeds in the garden and anywhere else she could find a weed. December 1938, Dorothy gave birth to their first child, Jan. 7 years later, Mike was born. 2 years after that, Jim came along. Then 4 more years, Paul David. Leanne completed their family in December of 1955. There were 17 years between the oldest and the youngest. Dorothy said, "Always having a kid in school keeps you young." To listen to Jan and Mike and Jim and Leanne talk about growing up on the farm with Pete as their daddy and Dorothy as their mom is a hoot. They have story after story about the fun they had with each other and the lessons they learned by watching their folks. They learned to work hard. They learned how to laugh. They learned to love each other. They learned to help other folks when they needed help. They learned what family was all about. As I said earlier, Pete and Dorothy's third son, Paul David, preceded them in death. Paul David was stricken in his early 20s with lupus, and it affected his kidneys. He went on dialysis in 1973, but went into remission and was able to come back home. He married Martha in 1975. But his health didn't hold, and after a kidney transplant, he died from complications at Dallas Presbyterian Hospital in 1978. Dorothy and Pete's solid faith in God is what carried them through. In addition to her own kids, Dorothy had many adopted by choice children that she loved dearly. Many of you who are sitting here today are among that group. These she prayed for, counseled, mentored, wrote letters to, encouraged, spent hours on the phone listening and guiding. And she always seemed to be able to do this without being judgmental. How many times did you hear Dorothy say, "I love you in spite of," fill in your own blank? She also said, "Love the sinner, but hate the sin." Dorothy loved to share her faith with everyone she came in contact with. I remember one time Dorothy told me that she sometimes let the telemarketers say their whole spiel to her on the phone. And then she would say, after listening patiently, "I've listened to what you had to say. Now would you listen to me for a few minutes?" She shared the gospel of Christ with more than a few telemarketers in that way.